Hello, it's nice to meet you again. Last time, while talking about the diagnosis of a child's disability, I mentioned that it is more important to recognize whether the child needs help or not, rather than the diagnosis itself. And I mentioned that one of the main reasons for getting a diagnosis is to receive government support, because although parents with young children may feel very disappointed and despair upon hearing this, based on my experience and many cases around me, I believe that individuals with developmental disabilities will need some level of help throughout their lives, and it is truly difficult to speak of a complete cure. There will be a time when we can separately discuss how we should think about the concept of a complete cure. In my opinion, what is far more important than the cause of the child's disability, or even the diagnosis itself, is acknowledging the child's difficulties and shortcomings. This is extremely important. It is equally difficult. In some cases, accepting that a child has a developmental disability is not difficult. However, in many cases, there are instances where it cannot be accepted. There are cases where neither the father nor the mother can accept it, and there are also cases where one of the two cannot accept it. The latter seems to cause more problems, in fact. When one of the two accepts it, but the other does not, it seems to become a seed of conflict between the couple. Even in an already difficult situation, there are often cases where they blame each other, and because of the stress from the child, they get angry over trivial matters. There are also many instances where they scold or reprimand the child under the pretext of parenting, and when they try to intervene or stop it, it can lead to a big argument. So even though they should be coming together to support each other because of the child, the marital relationship itself can become a bigger obstacle. And usually, this is a time when mothers are extremely stressed because of the child, while fathers are busy with work outside, leading mothers to complain that fathers don't pay much attention to the child. It's truly a very difficult situation with no similar solution. It seems that many families go through this process. Of course, fathers must be having a hard time too. However, in this situation, even though I am a father, I think the person who has it the hardest is probably the mother. Fathers can at least catch a brief break by going to work or handling outside tasks, but mothers usually spend 24 hours constantly with the child or taking them to treatments. So their fatigue and stress seem to be greater than that of fathers. So although it must be tough for fathers too, I believe it's really important to provide a lot of comfort and encouragement to mothers in this situation and to work together as a team. Ultimately, the best way to overcome this difficult situation is not to blame each other as a couple for the child's disability, but to quickly and healthily accept the child's disability and focus on how to help the child by working together. It's not easy, but I will talk about this in the next session as well. Usually in seminars, I don't talk about this for very long because it's mainly a seminar for delivering information. However, the reason I dedicate a lot of time to this part on YouTube is that I've seen many families struggle because they couldn't accept it. And beyond childhood, I've even seen cases where parents struggle into their children's adulthood because they can't accept their child's disability. Of course, the inability to accept it often occurs when the child is quite high functioning. So in the next session, I will continue to share my experiences because the process of acceptance doesn't happen in an instant, but gradually over a lifetime. How one embraces these processes is crucial in the relationship between the family and the child. In some cases, I've seen situations where the father and mother accept it, but the in-laws or the parents do not, preventing a diagnosis. It's already difficult for the parents, but then the in-laws or the parents block the process. They question why the child, who has no issues, is unnecessarily being diagnosed or labeled as autistic and suggest waiting. In this way, even though the parents want to quickly get a diagnosis and take action, there are cases where the parents block it, the in-laws or the parents. So although this is not the case for everyone, I think it might be more desirable for in-laws or parents to either observe from a distance or offer encouragement in such situations. Another phenomenon that occurs during this period is that mothers tend to blame themselves. Naturally, when something like this happens, you start to wonder if you did something wrong. Did I do something wrong to my child before pregnancy, during pregnancy, or after childbirth? This is a case of self-blame. As I mentioned before, if identifying the cause would solve the problem, then we should diligently search for the cause. However, finding the cause doesn't seem to be of much help in solving the problem so far. Moreover, if the mother is mentally too exhausted when the child needs help, it might be the mother who ends up needing help. Of course, there are cases where the father struggles as well. We need to acknowledge that both mothers and fathers can have a hard time. When things are tough, even if it feels like the child is being somewhat neglected, parents need to take a break and, if necessary, seek help from other professionals or people. In the event of an airplane accident, the first person who should put on the oxygen mask is not the child, but the parent. This is because only when the parent puts on the oxygen mask and breathes oxygen first can they save the child. I think this is the same. Parents need to be physically and mentally healthy first in order to help their children. Ultimately, acceptance is the biggest hurdle to overcome because parents need to be healthy first, and it is a mountain that must be crossed to help children healthily. So why is it so difficult to accept this? I encourage everyone watching this video to think about this carefully. Why can't I accept this? In fact, it's not very difficult to accept cases that are visibly apparent, like physical disabilities or Down syndrome. However, in the case of autism or intellectual disabilities, they are not easily visible and the issues are not apparent. So many think they can be hidden if the parents don't mention them. This is especially true for high-functioning autism. In most cases, those around them think something is odd, but often only the parents think otherwise. In fact, if you think about it, the parents also sense that something is off, but they have difficulty accepting that it is indeed the case. Therefore, when those around them try to mention that something seems off about their child, the parents often get upset and offended, making it difficult for others to bring it up, especially when children attend church or daycare at a young age. Parents are usually informed of any difficulties because support is needed. In places like church, don't they usually send children to Sunday school? In such cases, since the parents have experience raising children, they often sense that something is different. But even if the church tries to help, if the parents don't talk about it and think it's not an issue, it's very difficult to provide any assistance. Isn't that quite strange? It's quite ironic that the ones who should notice first are the parents, yet they are often the last to acknowledge it. So why is it so difficult to acknowledge this? If you think about it, I believe it's because parents feel ashamed that their child has a disability. Isn't it because they feel embarrassed? This is indeed a very important issue, because if parents are ashamed or embarrassed about their child's disability, it becomes difficult for the child to accept and not be ashamed of their own disability. Parents might think that since the child is still young, they don't express it verbally and it's not noticeable, but I believe that children instinctively sense it even if it's not expressed in words. Even if the child has difficulty communicating, I think this remains the same. When children are young, this may not be apparent, but it becomes evident during adolescence or adulthood. In such cases, I've often seen that the problems arising from the child not accepting their own disability can lead to more serious situations. As I mentioned, what problems might arise if this is not acknowledged? If a parent acknowledges that their child has issues but does not recognize it as a disability, it might be because they believe the child can be fixed. In the case of autism, since the issues are not visible on the surface, it might seem like talking to them, scolding them, or shouting at them could work. And they might think that punishing the child will correct their behavior, especially when children are very young, since they all seem quite similar, and parents have significant authority. They think this approach works to some extent. And in reality, it sometimes does work. Because the child is very young, the child might comply out of fear. However, the trauma that develops during this time often manifests negatively during adolescence. Children with developmental disabilities seem to be much more affected by physical punishment or discipline compared to typical children. Yes, I noticed this with my own child and also observed it in other children around me. In typical cases, if a child perceives yelling or physical punishment as a level 10, children with developmental disabilities seem to perceive the same intensity of punishment as 100 or even 1,000 times more. One of the characteristics of autism is having an excellent memory, and this might be related as well. It seems that especially the trauma from bad memories is much stronger and lasts longer than that from good memories. Therefore, what I want to tell parents is that yelling, scolding, punishing, or using corporal punishment may seem to have a temporary effect at the time, but it leads to more negative outcomes in the future. I want to emphasize that you should always help your children in a positive way. Raising a child with a disability in a strict manner may have good intentions, but in many cases, it seems to be more about one's pride, thinking, my child cannot be like that, rather than feeling sorry for the child's disability. In other words, it's because there is a tendency to identify oneself with the child. This seems to be particularly severe in our country, feeling proud. Only when the child graduates from a good university. Of course, this is true for all parents, but I feel that the intensity is particularly strong. Although there is an intention to correct the disability, in many cases, it can be seen as scolding because one cannot control their own temper. I am no exception to this. However, as I raise my child, I plan to share next time about the processes and experiences that have changed my various thoughts. I hope that this might be of some help. To parents who are currently raising young children, a child's developmental disability cannot be corrected by scolding or yelling. I think I gave an example last time about having a physical disability. For instance, if there is a disability in the leg, no parent would scold or yell to make the child walk properly. Naturally, they would provide crutches or a prosthetic leg to help them walk. Similarly, no parent would urge a child with poor eyesight to see better by pushing them hard. If necessary, they would arrange for surgery or provide glasses that suit the child's eyes. Parents who are unaware of their child's poor eyesight might push the child, telling them to open their eyes properly and look hard. Similarly, children with developmental disabilities have issues with certain brain functions, particularly in areas like social skills or communication, which they cannot autonomously control. It's absolutely not the child's fault. In fact, although I am sitting here now, it's not my fault that I am short, is it? Also, I've been losing a lot of hair recently, which is a bit stressful. But if I were to blame someone for this, I would have to blame my parents, because my parents were like that too. But then again, it's not my parents' fault either. So if you keep going up the chain of blame, eventually you would have to blame God. I believe that developmental disabilities are something we are born with, just like our appearance. It's no one's fault. As a Christian, I think of when Jesus' disciples asked about the blind man. Whose sin is it? When Jesus was asked this question, I believe that Jesus said, it was not that this man or his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be displayed in him. Sometimes parents who were strict with their children for not listening well when they were young later tried to be kind to them during their teenage or adult years after acknowledging their child's disability. However, by then, the child may avoid the parents out of fear. Parents who witness this often regret having been so strict when their children were young. It takes a very long time to reverse this. This is because it is not easy for children to change. I believe this applies not only to parents but also to school teachers or anyone around who might resort to corporal punishment. Just like parents, school teachers also sometimes administer punishment individually for disciplinary purposes. But there are cases where they punish groups as well. I don't know how it is these days, but when my child was young, teachers used to give punishments. Even though the school my child attends is a private school known for its character education, there were still instances where they punished my child with good intentions. At that time, my child was particularly picky with food and absolutely couldn't eat things like kimchi. However, the school forced my child to eat kimchi under the guise of food guidance. After being forced to eat it, my child would go and vomit. But even after seeing the vomiting, they thought it was okay to keep forcing it. Well, the school teacher did. Once we were bringing our child home, and there was a swimming pool at the school. It seems like the child had swimming that day. But when we got home, I saw that the child was holding a piece of kimchi in their mouth. This means that since they couldn't spit out the kimchi, they were forced to eat during lunch. In front of the teacher, they held it in their mouth throughout the swimming class. That's how difficult it is for our child. But the school teacher thinks that if you force it, it will work. I just used kimchi as an example, but there are countless such cases. If a child doesn't make eye contact and the teacher forcibly holds the child's face to make them look into their eyes, our children find it so difficult that they turn their eyes to the side, and their resistance is really strong, just to avoid making eye contact. I wonder if it's really necessary to do that. At the time, I didn't know better and left it to them, but looking back now, it's truly heartbreaking. Even now, if a child doesn't make eye contact or is a picky eater and someone tries to forcefully correct it for such reasons, I believe that is something that should never be done. Not only at that time, but it leaves a long-lasting trauma for our children. Therefore, I would like to ask school teachers not to scold or punish students with disabilities, but to understand them more and show them love. On the contrary, I believe that instead of negative training experiences, the memories of fun and being loved will remain more with our children. And this will become a driving force to positively change the disabilities they have. This is the direction I have become convinced of while raising my child and observing many families. Next time you might ask, so how do you acknowledge it? Isn't it something that can't be done at will? I am not saying that it will be 100% achieved overnight. In the process of raising our child, it seems to me that it is more about the parents changing rather than the child changing. This is the life we experience while raising children with disabilities. We will have time to share about those things. Thank you.